Okay, pleased to see you again. How to taste laconic words or terms presented through the discussion. They connote some differences between two legal traditions. As I've said, that is not the case for law students, but in pursuit of scholarly activities, many students across disciplines may find differences in the approach. So you can see, for example, a boomerang effect or butterfly effect. What are those? It is in principle compatible with continental counterparts. You should not praise sarcasm if you're not a common law student or this. Actually, that entails lengthy logic and a fine art creation. We should have to respond. The three-strike rule, for example, might approach as one of the final questions in your criminal law class. So, how do you understand custom as a source of law? Custom as a source of law is present in every legal tradition. The English common law has drawn extensively upon local custom. The Normans did not import a legal system from the continent. Indeed, according to Blackstone, the common law was nothing other than the custom of the realm from time immemorial, which the judges as living oracles were to discover. Local custom in England assumed an important function in aiding English judges in resolving a specific dispute. Custom was a basis for much of early criminal law, as well as for such family prescriptions as the rights of parents. Some local custom also existed separate from the common law, usually involving rules which were applicable to a very small group of people within a local community. These rules constitute exceptions to the common law. Local customs separate from the common law include rules regulating local fishermen, such as where they could dry their nets, or stipulating the characteristics of a right of way. Custom in this form differs from custom, which is part of common law only in its narrow and limited application, and its variance from the common law. With the passage of time, local customs often come to be modified to evolve into general customs, which are integrated as part of common law. The initial establishment of custom requires proof that it existed uninterrupted for a long period of time, and that it existed by common consent rather than by the use of force. Also, it must be consistent with other customs, contain certainty, and be accepted as obligatory and of significant importance. And it must be reasonable. Can custom be law before receiving any judicial affirmation? This is also a question usually posited in the first class of your civil law subject. And actually, many positivists of legal tradition usually employ in continental context the social custom as the most fundamental fundaments of a legal source. So they usually discuss the basis of law enforcement. What offers the ground for enforcement of law? what are the legal sources in scope, which is cognizant in our understanding and in dealings of practice. In contrast, the British positivists rather favor the state power, which may be traced back to monarch or king and other absolute symbols of legal significance. How do we draw upon difference in ways of dealings? Or does it only become law when a court draws it from use in print? So you are available names in eminence, for example, Yelling and in German context, and Austin and, in British context, Hart and Ronald Dworkin also such a famous treatise, Empire of Law, but he is a disciple of a Hart, but presented themes in productive context to address the practical needs of a legal theory. So, if court adopts a custom as the basis for decision, it is not doing so because the custom already possesses a status as law. If court refused to accept an alleged custom, it either was not a custom, or at least was not sufficiently a custom to constitute law. So it involves a point of delicacy between the traditions, and a contention may well be found among various views upheld by a scope of scholars. Judicial affirmation is required to find custom as law. How do you agree? If a context of a curtailed elements may proffer a ground for a legitimacy of custom, so separate views may be standing in the question. If the adoption of a custom by court allows the court to make a ruling without limiting its sources to precedent or legislation. If precedent does not exist as a primary source, then custom will seem to be of even a greater potential use to court seeking to expand its jurisdiction or seeking to avoid an appearance of lawmaking by identifying an acceptable source. So it is interesting to see the order in power of application. So it is secondary behind the statute in a continental state, behind the precedent in common law jurisdictions. So it is usual, but you can see a more fundamental point is related with the philosophical power, a kind of legitimate power to offer the ground of legal sources. In that context, custom should preempt the statute even in a tenet and a theoretical points of concern. But practically, it is secondary. Theoretically, it offers a foremost of a fundament. If the permissible source is a statute, but the statute is susceptible of varying interpretation, the use of custom as a source may avoid the charge of judicial making. If the custom supports the legislation, little objection is likely to come forth. Others may even suggest that there was no custom nor any need of mention of the custom, because the statute could be interpreted expansively to cover the case. If the custom is not supportive, but is not inconsistent with the statute, then there is greater potential challenge. But as long as the statute scheme does not seem violated, the custom would receive at least equivocal acceptance. Where the custom is inconsistent with the statute, however, a charge of judicial lawmaking is difficult to avoid. The use of such a custom in civil law system would appear less acceptable than in common law system. So more leeways practically for common law judges in contradiction between two sources of law. This is so not because a custom inconsistent with the statute has any priority in common law, but because multiple sources are more recognized. It is also easier to use such custom where the court is not compelled to give reasons supporting its conclusion. So, and other distinct area of legal sources would be conventions. Conventions are an influential source of English law, and along with custom, constitute the unwritten legal sources. Convention dictates expected conduct in functioning of judicial system as well as other institutions. No act of parliament specifies that there must be a prime minister, nor outlines the method by which the prime minister is chosen. So it is surprising. And convention usually be viewed in nexus with a public sector and governance, kind of a context of unwritten constitutional practices. It is according to convention that a prime minister is selected from the parliamentary or majority party, and that if the prime minister fails on a vote of confidence or a major government proposal, a resignation should follow. Convention additionally limits the conduct of sovereign. It is convention which caused King Edward to abdicate. A monarch should not marry a divorced person. It is also by convention that the sovereign carefully limits any exercise of the royal prerogative and follows the advice of prime minister in making cabinet and ministerial appointments and in granting royal assent to acts of parliament. Within the judicial structure, convention has long played a role in determining the respect to be given to the decisions of other courts, the right to issue dissents, and the commencement of certain disputes before a specific court, even though other courts possess concurrent jurisdiction. So it is actually a very cumbersome nature of a enactment. If you see the 1840s Judicature Act, in the area of a judicial structure, convention also comes into a major force to govern the arrangement. The several courts acts have codified and altered convention, but it remains an integral element of structure of these institutions. Convention exists in every society. It is part of every legal system. It prevails more successfully in a system where there is little emphasis on the codification of rules. Convention thus is less important in civil law systems. And other elements may be compatible with a political discourse. For example, what is the big society, theme of big society, now pursued by a prime minister? Well, what that means. So, actually, a tradition of a distinguishing between the private and public sectors is very strong, and also the aspect is, in some cases, a drivers in high contrast against other civilizations, for example, and so big society, it may be properly translated into big government in other states, for example, United States, and also a European statute law countries. A homogeneous society probably is more conducive to admitting convention, where tradition plays an important role, where the expectations of one individual with regard to the conduct of others tend to be common throughout the population. So they properly pursue to exercise a more vigor and a social engineering from the society in the floor level, and it is tactical and a strategy to address the current economic crisis. Do you agree? Convention is a flexible source of law, but nevertheless a source of exceptional importance in the machinery of justice in England. Then how do you understand the royal prerogative in the British legal tradition? Powers of the English monarch are severely limited. A sovereignty of crown, as contrast with sovereignty of parliament, is essentially a sovereignty symbolized loyalty to the monarch. The power of a monarch, called the royal prerogative, includes various rights exercised directly by the sovereign, with a subordinate sense of the prerogative, constituting a powers exercised by the government on behalf of the sovereign. The judicial system was highly centralized in the beginning years of Norman rule in England. The king was the supreme source of justice. Various devices, such as the writ system, allow the royal courts to increase their jurisdiction at the expense of local rural courts. The power of the king went unchallenged until the Magna Carta, 1215, the first formal check on royal power exceeded by the king. So, we are available on brief of the story involving King John and the barons. So it is kind of a rearrangement in justice about a feudal context of production and consumption. And the legitimate claim was allowed, enforced in the predicament of King John. But it is a significant event, momentum of history, to get back on a human rights conception, but there are many elements which entails the nature of a middle feudal ladder of a social system. So some commentators may have a points of departure in comparison with paradoxically, however, for example, John Dewey, who is an eminent educator in the United States, stressed the importance to ennoble the community. The Magna Carta comes in a novel context, so they failed to address the bottom line voices on human rights, just shield to protect the feudal interest for noble class. But in this contemporary world, we now talk about what are they? noblesse oblige was how do you ennoble the community. A democratic experience can be compatible in terms of a John Dewey through every ways of our day routine experience. Do you agree? So it's a point of delicacy also. The will of the king was no longer the law, though several countries later civil strife occurred over the issue of scope of royal power. The use of royal prerogative surged in the 16th century with the establishment of the Star Chamber. The Stuart kings extensively enlarged the royal prerogative based on their conceptions of the king's divine right. This challenge was met by common law advocates, and by the end of the 17th century, the prerogative was returned to a state of diminished exercise. The royal prerogative was never again the source of authority for the creation of new courts, such as the Star Chamber. So the Star Chamber actually had been seriously oppressive to serve the needs of a king. So the context of struggle between this oppressive regime and common law courts may be evinced by fames of a great scholars, for example. So Edwin Coke, and also who is a spirit of a common law, pioneering to reach the foundation of United States, and also leading force to forge the parliamentary system in Great Britain in the 17th century. The royal prerogative diminished even further with the Petition of Right Act 1860, which increased the citizens' ability to seek recourse against the sovereign for alleged wrongs. So usually we have the concept underpinned long decades, centuries, that king can do no wrong. So state immunity is a concept patronized and upheld by many legal scholars. But in modern times we have scope of statute enacted to address the wrongs of a state, which is performed apparently in the color of state. Then we can seek recourse against the king or the state. In Korea, it should be a state. Well, what is state immunity? In United States and United Kingdom have statutes recently, centuries ago, enacted just a century ago. So it is as latest to have corrections about a civil justice between the state and a persons involving tort damages. The sovereign's immunity from civil proceedings again was altered by Crown Proceedings Act 1957, all but eliminating ancient rules restricting procedures against the sovereign. Comparatively little remains of royal prerogative, although the monarch still plays an important role in the functioning of the government. A few formal powers remain, essentially summoning and dissolving parliament, rendering royal assent to bills, presiding over the private council, conferring honors, granting pardons, appointing some state officers, approving cabinet and ministerial appointments, appointing leading clerks, and concluding treaties. Many of these are illusory powers. Nevertheless, the monarch does not personally select the prime minister, but acts according to the will of the leaders of the parliamentary party. It is unlikely that the royal prerogative will increase in scope in the future. So a pump and a protocol may fall within the sphere of a royal power. How do you see it? A formalistic or just illusory, which substantially depends on the decision of other political branches. It is the monarchy is more symbol than a source of authority. The royal prerogative is at the command of Parliament. I'd like to change my scheme on class progress. We need to review the article presented by R. Reishi, but I find it more urgent to explore other sections in generalization, but includes the main substances to facilitate your grasp of this class. So I forego the article and advance to the section of legislation. If time permits, in the next class, I'll give some points drawn from the article in essence. So, what is the legislation as a source of law? The authority of legislation in England or United States or in any other common law nation may appear quite a fundamental to observers in each nation. Enactments of the principal legislative bodies become law, which must be followed. In the United States, complex questions about the effectiveness of the legislation may arise because of the existence of both federal and a state legislature. Is the matter enumerated in the Constitution for the Federal Congress? Is the matter one of special residual delegation to the states and thus not for federal action? So actually, this kind of questions are usually posed in principally because the United States is a federal union, and the federal system in itself constitutes a myriad of a difficult legal subject, which law students have to stick on to deliberate. These questions do not arise in England. Parliamentary enactments are not questioned by a challenging legislative competence. With few exceptions, Parliament is sovereign in legislating domestic law. So, how do you find differences against the Korean practice? The kind of question concerning federal system is not pertinent in the Korean context. But do you see the supremacy or a parliamentary sovereignty as beset with the prescribed constitution allowed by people and upstaged in the context of a constitutional adjudication? So three systems may differ in points, although bear many similarities as crossed among another. It may enact unwise laws which the court nevertheless in theory are bound to apply. The English Constitution does not contain fundamental rights which may lead to parliamentary decrees being invalidated by the courts as unconstitutional. This should not suggest, however, that there exists an unchallenged acceptance of all acts of Parliament. The vast amount of a statutory law is thought by many judges to be inconsistent with and a threat to the stability of the common law. Legislation gains authority when judicially interpreted, and methods of judicial interpretation by the English courts are more highly defined than in the United States. Absent the ability to rule legislation unconstitutional, the English courts have finally turned a system by which legislation is interpreted. Courts thus have significant influence on the post-enactment development of statutory law, since enacted law is only effective when the courts permit it to be applied. Well, there is no judicial review of statute as in England. The court may effectively nullify a statute by the method of construction. Is the court in the following excerpt mere strictly construing the act, or is it using the common law to effectively diminish the value of the act? So, we can derive some points in essence to reveal the interplay in this area. Is the case titled National Assistance Ball versus Wilkins. Devlin. It is a well-established principle of construction that a statute is not to be taken as effecting a fundamental alteration in the general law, unless it uses words that point unmistakably to the conclusion. Accordingly, if the words "a man shall be liable to maintain his wife" in Section 42 of the National Assistance Act 1947 stood by themselves, I should read them subject to the common law, and should not conclude that they were intended to disturb the principle that a wife forfeited her right to maintenance by the commission of a matrimonial offense. Against this, it is argued that the initial phrase "for the purpose of this act" makes it possible to give the wide words that follow their full meaning without altering the general law. The same sort of wide words are, however, used in the Poor Law Act 1927, Section 41A4, which provides that it shall be the duty of a husband of a poor person to maintain her. These words are not subject to any limitation of the purposes of the act, and they are moreover contained in a consolidating act. I could not therefore hold that the Act of 1927 altered the common law, and it is noteworthy that no one has in 20 years ever suggested that it did. But if words of this sort are not to be widely and literally construed in 1927, why should they in 1948? The qualifying phrase "for the purposes of this act" is not, in my judgment, sufficient to effect the alteration. The use of the phrase is sufficiently explained by the inclusion in the section of novel inliability in the case of women, and by a wish to avoid consequences, as demonstrated in Middlesex versus Nathan of the restricted words in the Act of 1927. It is another principle of a statute construction that the court leans against an interpretation which produces unjust and arbitrary consequences. I think it would be unjust if a husband were compelled to support a wife in open and admitted adultery. It would be arbitrary if the amount of money he had to spend on honor depended on the speed with which he was able to obtain his degree absolute. So, of course, in theory, the statute should be respected in the case law or countries of case law, common law. And as I've said, judicial sanctification transforms the abstract nature of a statute into more concrete of law. So, but practically it involves a points of leeways amenable to diverse contexts of interpretation. So it is one point of tactics or other and technicality actually to adapt into a more fine justice in a case. I do see some tendency or propensity actually that the institutional concern or aspect are very powerful to the question. So actually we talk about the separation of powers and that is embedded in practice in Great Britain, also eminently pronounced in the express language of the United States Constitution. But what are those? And the procedure of NSP may factor its interplay. So finally, in terms of a judicial nature of involving a case of controversy, may direct the court also treat it to some intertwine, a mosaic of a points in meditation to adapt and accommodate actually expected to play under the statute, but many technicality may be exploited to ensure a specific justice, which is crucial points that the court is responsible for. In this case, you see the familial duty of husband to support the wife, but his wife committed an adultery. How do you find justice in this case? Do you agree with court opinion? How do you agree on the logic and metaphors the court employed to accommodate the command of statute in adaptation? Any statute is capable of being viewed from several different perspectives. The English have developed several rules of interpretation. What rule is adopted may depend on what is the responsibility of judiciary in interpreting a statute. We saw a conflict in interpreting a previous cases. Some judges are reluctant to follow previous decisions and rather openly express their reluctance. Others share the same disdain for an earlier decision but find a way to distinguish it. And still others may apply, however, reluctantly, the earlier decision because that is how they view their responsibility toward the precedent as a source of law. With regard to statute, there may be a strong personal antipathy to a particular statute, but no judge will simply rule that it is not binding. He might, however, emasculate the statute by its method of interpretation, just as he might a previous case with which it disagrees. So practically, it is kind of a gray area in some sense. There is no space that the latent time rule applies among the class of a statute. It is a matter of separate, distinct institutions between judiciary and a parliament. And also another remnants in tradition may be illustrated in the case of United States, which requires a strict element qualify for constitutional review. You can see a standing requirement including a ripeness or mootness doctrine and other many technical points of eligibility to judicial review. Example, loss of damages, which should be concrete, and the court should be ripe that the relief granted by court could practically address the harms incurred by wrongdoers or a state constitutional measure of a government. For example, one may approach statutory interpretation through a strict law, a literal interpretation of statute, without regard to what such ruling does to reason or justice. The literal approach has much support in the English cases. And we also have other sources of interesting points about this area of concern, but I should have to be on the Constitution. Let's see. How do you understand the Constitution in United Kingdom? Defining the constitutional law of the United Kingdom is made complex by the absence of a single constitutional document. Most common law nations have a constitutional document, although this does not mean it includes a Bill of Rights or that the Constitution grants the judiciary the power of judicial review of legislation for constitutional inconsistencies. But the absence of a single document of British constitutional law has led to a creation of a myth. British constitutional law is frequently noted as being based on an unwritten constitution. It is true only in the sense that the constitutional law is not contained in a single document. The complex and abstract nature of British constitution results from it being an aggregation of numerous sources, mostly written but all identifiable. Changes in any of the sources which comprise the British Constitution will alter its total structure, making it more flexible than many constitutions. The Constitution is affected by most traditional sources of English law, including the royal prerogative, conventions, common law, a few of the more important acts of Parliament, and more recently the addition of acts of the European Communities. Clarity of identifying the British Constitution is dependent upon recognizing its sources. The existence of custom, conventions, and the royal prerogative do not render this an easy task. The most important elements of British Constitution are the Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, 1628, and several statutes enacted by Parliament. The Act of Union with Scotland, 1707, while classified as a parliamentary act, has a special status over most other acts, a status given also to the Bill of Rights, 1689. The Act of Settlement, 1700, and the Habeas Corpus Act, 1679, additionally constituent elements of British constitutionalism. So in the century of a 20th, a 17th, we can see a plethora of institutions which is fundamental to address a democratic state, where the law as the aura of constitutionalism is unknown until the courts have discussed that issue, which they only infrequently do. Thus, it is difficult to classify a legal law. Uniquely important is the European Communities Act 1972, which joined England to the European communities. So the formalistic concept about the hierarchy of various laws are not familiar in the context of United Kingdom, which is unlike, of course, with other countries. This added a new sources of law, the lawmaking bodies of committees. Community law takes a precedence over domestic United Kingdom law. If not applied by the United Kingdom courts, it will be by the European Court of Justice. External to the direct and indirect effects of Acts of Parliament on the British Constitution are custom and the English common law. The most significant constitutional aspect of common law is the role of judicial decisions in protecting civil liberties. The 17th century Bill of Rights does not guarantee individual liberties. Where such rights are protected, the sources were various conventions, judicial decisions, and statutes. So you can see it is the most heightened form of a approach in the constitutional matter to ensure individual liberties. So we are a very civilized country to have this updated version of constitution. There is some delicacy indifference between civil liberties and individual liberties. A contemporary written Bill of Rights in England has been sought by many for years, but many argue against the modern Bill of Rights. Lord Denning article would be guiding to this area of concern. I'll present a brief about the law of the European Economic Community in England in purview of a sources law about common law system. So the ratification of Treaty of Accession and the European Communities Act 1972 initiated England's entry into the European communities. So you know, on several institutions to incorporate the European states in purpose of promoting the economy, a European Economic Community, a European Coal and Steel Community, and European Atomic Energy Community. So it is an international organization which may be viewed in separate context, but largely it constitutes some kind of a mid-level union, we usually call it now as European Union, and principally that possess the character of a commercial integration, which also instituted kind of a soft nature of a political governance. But what extent can we perceive in terms of a political integration raises a difficult question. For example, there are concepts about the hierarchy of law between European statute and the laws of each country, each member state, and also how they perceive the European Court of Justice in the context of European interest is meaningful. England follows the dualist theory of international law. A treaty does not, by accession, become the law of the United Kingdom. The Treaty of Accession was thus not self-executing. So the doctrine of presumption of non-self-executing treaty is popular through both jurisdictions, including United Kingdom and United States. So the judge should find some distinct elements which allows the state of treaty as a domestic law, which is applicable in the courts, national courts. For example, they need to find some realistic context of a provision or language which have potential to be directly applicable to the case, or they may pursue to find some kind of a assertive language to consider or recognize the state treaty as kind of a domestic law, other than any special processes of accession or incorporation. So, a point of delicacy and presumption of doctrine, a doctrine of non-self-executing treaty may have potential to vastly exclude the application of treaty in the domestic context. So that is a point of distinction. And what is that? Parliament had to act to give England's participation a legal standing. Parliament not only accepted community law existing at the time of the act, but it agreed to adopt directly applicable community legislation of council or commission enacted a subsequent to entry. Parliament thus delegated law-making power to community institutions, although limited to rights and obligations created by the text of treaties. So this is also the point of controversy. If the Constitution delegates a specific power of enactment to Parliament, how do we legitimate the lawmaking power of a community institutions in the context of a British Constitution, for example, or United States Constitution? Such kind of international organization have the authority on legitimate ground to make the domestic law, the laws in domestic effect. There is a question, a threshold question, institutionally and structurally. Community legislation, which is not directly applicable, requires parliamentary action to become effective in the United Kingdom. Such legislation may be implemented by statute, or the more likely course, in the 1972 Act, by subordinate legislation adopted by the English executive under delegated authority. Then, also, they usually question if the delegation authorized by principally, and in many cases by president or other monarch, have the power in substitute or as an alternative compatible with the Congress or Parliament. Community law includes sources beyond treaties and secondary legislation. Decisions of the European Court of Justice may become an important source of law, both as precedent in that court and in courts in the United Kingdom. A decision of Court of Justice does not nullify a member state law, but the decision must be followed in member state courts if it pertains to meaning or effect the treaties or the meaning or validity of a community instrument. So you can see differences against the Korean practice also. In Korea, the act or provisions of statute declared unconstitutional by the Constitution Court are to be annulled as a matter of a state statutory constitutional and statutory construction. In abstract nature, which is absolute through every square aspects of a governmental function. So, and in the practice of the United States, the constitutional justification specifically address the case. So that is not invalidated in abstract terms. Theoretically, there are separate views possible through the courses of administration, but actually the court ruling to invalidate the statute or annul the provision of laws then means it to become a national law, as indebted to press or other ways of public notice. It is a practical force to penetrate similar forms of statute or other governmental actions to be powerless. And so most state legislature usually follow the precedent and practice also. So that's the difference. United Kingdom courts are bound by European Court of Justice decision. Were community law to become unacceptable in the United Kingdom, the only method to renounce the law would be political, not judicial, mandating a withdrawal from the community by repealing the European Communities Act. The effect of any action less than withdrawal, such as an act of parliament in conflict with the European Communities Act, remains a matter of some debate. The traditional view that one parliament cannot bind another tends to prevail. Parliament has been sensitive in avoiding passing laws in conflict with the Acts of Union and of emancipation of the colonies and dominions. You seem similarly aware of problems associated with passing laws in conflict with participation in the communities. The impact of community law is thus relatively unchallenged, but how large an impact it will make is uncertain. And a final topic was drawn on from the session of Roman law. So it was briefed in the beginning of this class. So you may have the point in a grand picture between the civil law or Roman law and common law. the strong nature and broad ambit of a common law elements, which now is very influential, but actually you can see some antedated interplay, which is also remained in some pivotal context in the case. So now we early English codes, for example, the area of canon law and other medieval scholars inculcated by a civil law education at Oxford and Cambridge, and also some sheer preserve of family law issues, formalities of wills or succession law. So, where early English codes were not aided by precedent and turned to opinions of such writers as Bracton, there was a further indirect application of Roman law principles. For example, Bracton's classification of bailments follows directly the Roman categorization. A subsequently was adopted in an early English decision. In other instances, a bailment is one of concepts you usually encounter in a property class. And subsequently was adopted in an early English decision. So in other instances, judges have considered Roman doctrines when difficult questions were presented, and there was no direct traditional source of English law as a guide. All legal systems tend to benefit from others, particularly as competitive legal study becomes more prevalent. Where there has been no attempt to codify vast areas of the law, there are bound to be gaps which require judges to seek guidance from other sources. Other legal systems in civilized nations, whether they are common or civil law systems, may provide the guidance. If the Roman law has been considered appropriate guidance in particular case, this should not suggest that there has been a reception of the Roman law. Reception means a direct acceptance of the Roman law as a principal source of law. That has not been a characteristic of development of English common law. So we need to be scrupulous about the use of term. Reception is weighty in our recognition, other than many other words. Then we now surface a new topic, divisions of English law, which to be for next task in next class, which should be Friday morning. So I appreciate your hard engagement through 2 hours math, actually. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on Friday.